Imagine trying to negotiate, like a really high-stakes peace treaty. But the person sitting right across the table from you, they might not actually have the authority to sign it.
Right, which is already a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, and to make matters even more complicated, their boss, the supreme authority who actually pulls the strings, is entirely missing from the picture.
Just completely gone.
Exactly. You sit down in this highly secure room to hash out terms that could literally prevent a massive regional war, and you realize the leadership structure you're trying to negotiate with might just be, well, a mirage.
It's honestly one of the most unpredictable scenarios in modern statecraft.
Mm-hmm.
You're attempting to de-escalate a crisis using traditional diplomatic levers, but those levers aren't attached to anything solid.
Right.
The internal architecture of the state you're dealing with is essentially a black box right now, which, makes every single maneuver incredibly volatile.
Oh, absolutely. And welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today we are unpacking a stack of breaking news transcripts and intelligence summaries regarding the really intense, rapidly evolving conflict between the United States and Iran.
Specifically, we're looking at the massive escalation that's taken place since February 28th.
Right. And for you listening right now, our mission today is to break down an almost unbelievable contrast in our source material, because we are seeing simultaneous reports of highly sensitive secret diplomatic back channels operating in the shadows.
While on the exact same day, we're witnessing the deployment of one of the largest, most heavily armed military blockades in recent history.
It's wild.
The juxtaposition is profound. We're watching whisper quiet, delicate diplomacy being attempted directly beneath the shadow of just immense, overwhelming military firepower.
Yeah.
And understanding how those two extremes interact is really the key to grasping this entire crisis.
So let's start with the immediate breaking news that triggered this analysis in the first place. According to the transcripts, Iranian state media is loudly and aggressively broadcasting that their foreign minister is heading to Islamabad, Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
However, they are making a very specific, highly publicized point of denying that this trip has absolutely anything to do with negotiating with the United States.
Right.
They're telling their domestic audience and, the world that this is purely routine.
And that vocal denial out of Tehran is a really critical data point. It's a very intentional piece of messaging.
Yeah.
But when you look at the broader intelligence picture, that public stance is immediately contradicted by the reality of the logistics on the ground.
Yeah, because the White House is telling a completely different story. Our sources show the administration confirming that U.S. Special Envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are heading to Islamabad tomorrow morning for direct talks. And these talks are being intermediated by the Pakistanis. The U.S. side is openly stating that the president called on the Iranians to reach out, that Tehran actually requested this in-person conversation, and so the U.S. is, sending its envoys to listen.
It's a classic diplomatic back channel. Pakistan shares a border with Iran. They have this complex historical relationship, and they serve as a relatively neutral ground where these two adversaries can technically occupy the same space without having to actually host each other.
Right.
But the sheer friction between Iran's public denial and the reality of the U.S. envoys landing in Islamabad tells us a lot about the fragility of the Iranian state right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if an organization requests a meeting to de-escalate a crisis, they usually want some credit for engaging in diplomacy, right?
Usually, yeah.
The fact that the Iranian Foreign Ministry is publicly denying a meeting they reportedly asked for suggests a massive internal rift. It feels like watching a corporate board where the CEO is trying to execute a merger, but the PR department and the security team are actively trying to sabotage it in the press.
What's fascinating here is that your analogy gets right to the heart of Iranian internal politics. This denial isn't just about saving face on the international stage, It exposes a deeply fractured regime.
Oh, so?
Well, according to the intelligence summaries, there are massive fissures between the civilian political officials, like the foreign minister and the parliament, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC.
Okay.
These two factions operate almost as parallel states right now.
And the IRGC being the hardline military wing that essentially controls the country's security apparatus and, proxy networks, they hold the real physical power.
Precisely. So you have the civilian political class desperately trying to open a pressure valve through these talks in Islamabad because the economic and military strain is just becoming unbearable. Yeah. But they are facing severe, potentially existential pushback from the IRGC. The IRGC's entire mandate is built on projecting unyielding resistance. So you have a situation where the political wing is trying to negotiate a ceasefire, while the military wing is using state media to deny the talks even exist. They're fighting for control of the domestic narrative.
Which introduces a glaring, really terrifying variable into this equation.
Yeah.
Because if the Iranian leadership is this fractured, with the diplomats passing notes through Pakistan while the military actively resists the process, who actually holds the authority to finalize a deal?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, because the source material paints a very murky picture of the one person who usually forces these factions to fall in line.
The supreme leader.
Yeah.
And right now, his status is the defining mystery of this entire geopolitical crisis. The assessments provided by foreign policy advisors in our transcripts state that he has not been seen publicly and is reportedly wounded, quote, if not worse. The regime's internal security has thrown a complete blanket over his whereabouts and physical condition, which in an autocratic system usually implies a severe crisis of continuity.
Because a regime built around absolute centralized authority simply cannot function effectively if the pinnacle of that power structure is missing, especially not in the middle of a hot conflict.
No, not at all. Historically, if you look at the mechanics of the Iranian government, major geopolitical concessions require a strong, singular supreme leader to force consensus.
Right.
Take the end of the Iran-Iraq War in 1988 or the 2015 JCPOA nuclear agreement. Both of those decisions were fiercely opposed by hardline elements within the military.
Because giving up the nuclear program or accepting a ceasefire after years of brutal war felt like a capitulation to the West. The hardliners viewed it as a betrayal of their revolutionary principles.
Absolutely. The only mechanism that allowed those historic agreements to survive the internal infighting was the supreme leader stepping in, issuing a definitive ruling, and basically dragging the entire state apparatus across the finish line.
Right, forcing them to accept it.
Exactly. Without that singular, unquestionable authority imposing a decision, those deals would have been torn apart by internal factions. So right now, with the supreme leader reportedly incapacitated, there is no clear chain of command capable of overruling the IRGC.
And the mechanical reality of how these factions are communicating right now makes that lack of leadership even more dangerous.
Yeah, it really does.
Because our sources highlight that Iran's electronic communications infrastructure has been severely degraded by the conflict. They are operating in a state of extreme paranoia regarding signal intelligence.
They understand that in modern warfare, emitting an electronic signal, whether it's a cell phone or radio or even a secure satellite link, is basically painting a target on your own back.
Yeah.
The moment you transmit, your location is triangulated and a strike follows. Because of this, the Iranian command structure has largely abandoned modern telecommunications for anything sensitive.
So wait, you're telling me in the middle of a modern war, they're basically playing a high-stakes game of telephone without cell service?
That's exactly what I'm telling you. They are reverting to physical messengers.
Mm-hmm.
They are literally writing down operational orders and diplomatic negotiating points on paper, handing them to a courier, and having that person physically travel across the country to deliver the message.
That is insane.
It completely shatters the speed of their decision-making.
Uh-huh.
If the negotiators in Islamabad reach a critical juncture and need authorization to compromise, they cannot just pick up a secure phone to Tehran.
Right.
That request has to be physically routed through intermediaries.
Right.
It is highly reminiscent of the operational constraints we saw in the recent Israel-Hamas war, where negotiations had to be carried by hand down into tunnel networks.
And that extreme delay in communication is what makes the situation on the water so incredibly volatile. Because while the diplomats are waiting days for couriers to travel back and forth, the naval standoff in the region is moving at the speed of sound.
Yeah.
While diplomacy crawls, the physical military escalation is blistering.
The contrast in velocity is staggering. On one track, you have 19th century courier diplomacy. On the other, you have a 21st century hypermodern naval confrontation.
Let's look at the mechanics of what is actually happening on the water right now. According to the reports, Iran's gunboats have moved to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm-hmm.
And in a direct tit-for-tat escalation, U.S. forces have seized Iranian tankers in the Indian Ocean, alongside 2 additional ships right inside the strait itself.
And when we talk about closing the Strait of Hormuz, it's vital to understand the geography and the asymmetric warfare involved. The strait is a relatively narrow transit corridor. Iran doesn't need massive destroyers to threaten it.
Right.
Their doctrine relies on heavily armed fast-attack swarm boats, anti-ship missiles stationed on the coastline, and naval mines. Just the credible threat of those assets being deployed causes international shipping insurance rates to skyrocket, effectively freezing maritime traffic.
It's an economic chokehold. But the U.S. response outlined in our sources isn't just about seizing a few ships in retaliation. It is a fundamental, overwhelming shift in military posture. President Trump has authorized the Department of War, led by Secretary Pete Hegseth, with a green light for lethal and kinetic action if U.S. assets are threatened.
And the definition of those U.S. assets currently deployed is what truly changes the calculus. The scale of the buildup is astronomical.
We are looking at 3 U.S. aircraft carriers currently operating in the Middle East. The USS George W. Bush has joined the Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea.
Yeah.
The transcripts explicitly note that this is the first time since the 2003 Iraq War that 3 U.S. Navy carriers have been dispatched to this specific region, and back during that massive invasion, they had 5.
To put that into perspective for you, a single U.S. carrier strike group operates essentially as a sovereign floating military base.
Oh, yeah.
It carries more advanced firepower than the entire air forces of many developed nations. To deploy 3 of them simultaneously, alongside their accompanying destroyers, cruisers, and submarine escorts, represents an almost unimaginable concentration of destructive capability.
The sources detail over 200 aircraft and 15,000 sailors and Marines on board these strike groups, fully armed and at the ready. Dan Kenny, an advisor standing right next to Secretary Hegseth, confirmed that these U.S. forces are postured to launch immediately if these back-channel talks in Pakistan fail.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? Are we basically trying to talk peace while holding the biggest stick imaginable right off their coast?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is exactly the strategic logic at play. When you're dealing with a decentralized, fractured adversary where the political wing wants peace but the military wing wants conflict, standard diplomatic incentives often fail. The logic behind deploying 3 carrier strike groups is to create an undeniable existential threat that forces internal cohesion. The U.S. is essentially trying to compel whatever leadership structure remains in Iran to override the hardliners out of sheer necessity for survival.
And yet, even with this massive U.S. naval armada off the coast and the internal chaos inside Iran, you read through these intelligence briefings and congressional transcripts, and you see 2 completely different strategic philosophies emerging from American policymakers.
Yeah, you really do.
They are looking at the exact same battlefield and coming to entirely opposite conclusions about what this conflict has actually achieved since February 28th. Now, before we dive into this, I want to make it crystal clear to you listening. We are not endorsing either side of this political debate.
Right, absolutely not.
We are merely reporting the opposing arguments exactly as they are presented in the source material to give you the complete picture. We're totally impartial here.
Just laying out the facts from the transcripts. It is a fascinating analytical divide, though. You have highly experienced voices arguing completely different definitions of what constitutes strategic leverage in modern warfare.
Let's examine the critical left-wing perspective first, which is articulated in our sources by Hakeem Jeffries. His core argument is that, despite the carrier groups, Iran is actually in a stronger position now, with more leverage than they held before this escalation began. He points to 3 specific realities on the ground. The regime itself remains intact and has not collapsed. Their core nuclear stockpile has not been decimated. And crucially, Iran now actively controls the Strait of Hormuz.
And this view is entirely anchored in immediate geographic and economic leverage. The Strait of Hormuz is the central artery for global energy markets. I mean, roughly 20% of the world's total oil consumption passes through that narrow waterway.
That's a huge number.
It is. So Jeffries is arguing that by physically occupying that space and demonstrating the ability to shut down global commerce, Iran has acquired a trump card.
Right, because if they shut down the strait, global oil prices spike, inflation surges worldwide, and the economic pain for the West becomes a massive political liability. Holding that economic trigger is a form of immense power.
Exactly. Even if their military takes a beating, the capability to inflict acute, immediate pain on the global economy gives them tremendous bargaining power at the negotiating table. It's a very tangible, immediate form of leverage.
But then you flip to the right-wing, administration-aligned view presented in the transcripts by Dan, a former Bush administration advisor.
Yeah.
He completely rejects that premise. He argues that Iran's capabilities are fundamentally discombobulated. He looks at the timeline since February 28th and points out that Iran's traditional military, like their air force and navy, has been effectively neutralized.
Right.
Furthermore, their ballistic missile industrial base and drone manufacturing facilities have been wiped out.
He is focusing on the systemic destruction of their ability to project power long term. But the most critical point he raises is the degradation of their proxy networks.
Groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Dan notes that these networks, which Iran spent decades and billions of dollars building up across the Middle East, are severely degraded.
And that strikes at the very core of Iranian military doctrine. Because for decades, Iran has operated on a strategy of forward defense.
Right.
Instead of fighting adversaries on their own borders, they used proxy militias in Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, and Yemen to keep their enemies engaged far away from Tehran. Dan's argument is that without those proxies and without the industrial base to supply them with drones and ballistic missiles, Iran's strategic depth has vanished. They're isolated and exposed.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How can two seasoned political voices look at the exact same battlefield and come away with completely opposite conclusions about who has the leverage? One side looks at a map and says they hold the most important economic choke point in the world, therefore they are winning. The other side looks at the infrastructure and says their industrial base is a smoking ruin and their regional armies are depleted, therefore they are entirely defanged.
It's a fundamental disagreement on the currency of power. And this raises an important question for anyone analyzing global conflicts today. Which form of power actually dictates the outcome of a negotiation? Geographic leverage allows you to inflict immediate economic pain, which is powerful. But infrastructural leverage, the ability to actually sustain a state, build weapons, and project force regionally, is what guarantees long-term survival.
Right.
Dan is essentially arguing that holding a choke point is meaningless if your entire command and control apparatus is too broken to survive a prolonged engagement with 3 U.S. carrier strike groups.
And that brings us right back to the central paradox we've been unpacking today. You have an overwhelmingly dominant, hyper-modern U.S. military force incorporating 200 aircraft and 15,000 personnel, staring down a regime that is so internally fractured and terrified of electronic surveillance that they are literally relying on hand-delivered notes to communicate with their own diplomats.
It creates an incredibly volatile environment for Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff heading into Islamabad.
I can't even imagine.
They are negotiating with an entity that has its finger on the trigger of global oil markets, but might not have a functional brain capable of deciding when or if to pull it.
So we turn it over to you. As you listen to these two wildly different assessments of the battlefield, what stands out to you? Do you think the overwhelming presence of those 3 U.S. carrier strike groups will successfully force a fractured Iranian regime into a diplomatic deal?
Or does Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz give them the ultimate leverage to dictate terms, regardless of their ruined infrastructure and missing supreme leader?
Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We genuinely read through them, and it always sparks fascinating debates among the community.
It's really a situation where the standard rules of diplomatic engagement simply do not apply, and predicting the outcome requires understanding both the economic pressures and the military realities simultaneously.
And remember, this puzzle is moving incredibly fast. These high-stakes diplomatic talks we've been breaking down, the back-channel meetings intermediated by the Pakistanis, they are kicking off in Islamabad tomorrow morning.
Very soon.
We are going to be closely tracking every development, analyzing the rhetoric, and watching the fallout from Kushner and Witkoff's negotiations. Something very special is coming up as we trace the real-world results of these back-channel talks, and you absolutely won't want to miss how this plays out.
The decisions made in the next 48 hours, whether communicated by secure satellite or a handwritten note, could fundamentally redefine the security architecture of the entire Middle East.
So, if you had an aha moment today, or if you just gained a clearer understanding of the massive moving parts behind today's headlines, hit that like button, share this deep dive with a friend who loves global politics, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming coverage.
Thanks for joining us.
And I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on as you watch the news unfold over the next few days. If a regime's internal communication is so heavily degraded that they have to rely on handwritten notes passed through intermediaries just to authorize a basic diplomatic response, let me rephrase that. How long can they realistically maintain coordinated tactical control over a global economic choke point like the Strait of Hormuz before a miscommunication sparks an irreversible kinetic conflict? You sit down to negotiate that high-stakes peace treaty we talked about at the beginning, but if the boss is missing and the couriers are delayed, who is actually stopping the guns from firing?